G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we are looking at my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Spanish Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We'll get straight into all the key talking points and headlines, making news around the F1 world. And first thing I wanted to cover off, certainly in the F1 fantasy circles, is the constructor battle. Now, it was pretty clear that Ferrari had an absolute stinker of a weekend in Canada. Red Bull have looked very much off the pace of late, and Mercedes certainly have arrived at the forefront of the discussion when it comes to choosing constructors in our teams. I myself rolled with Mercedes in Canada. I wasn't sure if it would be beyond a 1 week punt, but there is some speculation that Mercedes could very well be back on form again after a couple of good results for them, fantasy-wise at least, in Monaco and then again in Canada. I think Ferrari in particular are going to have a bounce-back weekend. They're also bringing upgrades, and I think, as what is saying here, should deliver some improved performance and a good step forward for the team. McLaren, in my opinion, have been the most consistent constructor throughout 2024, fantasy-wise at least. And even though there are some concerns around the higher speed corners, it seems as though they will make up some ground in the lower speed corners at least. It's going to be a very interesting track, very different to the last few we've raced on. But I think most interestingly about this Barcelona Catalunya track is that it is very much Red Bull-esque. Max has a great record at this track, and again, moving into Austria, the following race weekend is also very much a Red Bull track. So I think Red Bull are very much back on the menu in terms of a constructor to think about. But I think, as has been the case, as I've harped on about non-stop this season and in seasons prior, Sergio Perez is what the Red Bull constructor hinges on for the most part. Now, we know Max is always going to be around the top three just about every race week, but Sergio's inconsistency, and we're back on the European leg again where he had a diabolical few races last season, makes me think that unless we see a bit more consistency from him, Red Bull are probably in a void for the time being, just because of the fact that they are 3 to 4 million more than their rivals in F1 Fantasy. And so I think if Red Bull are scoring just about the same as McLaren and Ferrari, you may as well go for those two instead and use that extra bit of money to upgrade other parts of your team, whether it be a Logan Sargent to a Yuki Tsunoda or something like that. So I do think Red Bull will turn it around in Spain and Austria the next couple race weekends. But right now, I just don't think for me they're in the conversation. I've got Mercedes, I've got Ferrari, and I'm looking at maybe getting in McLaren for one of those two teams. So Red Bull are probably the odd man out, although it is probably quite close between Mercedes and Red Bull, I think. Then above them, for me, it's Ferrari and then McLaren on top just because of that consistency. So it is very much an open-ended question as to which constructor is the best. I don't have a perfectly right answer for you, and I don't think there is going to be one for the next couple of race weekends until we see some consistency from Red Bull or a drop-off in form from one of the other teams relative to their peers. So I do think, as fast as pit stop I've got here, McLaren and Ferrari are probably the top two teams over Red Bull right now. But again, we'll have to wait and see what free practice unveils, because there has been quite a few surprises of late in free practice. And that's meant people like myself have taken punts on Mercedes constructor, for instance, which have, as was the case in Canada at the very least, reaped the reward. So one eye on free practice this weekend, because I think there's going to be a few really interesting surprises, and that could set our teams up for the next couple of race weeks as a result of that. The other thing I wanted to look at for this week was also the 2X DRS boost selection. Now, I usually talk about this as part of this video every week, but I do want to go into a bit more detail because of the fact that we've got this Austria sprint coming up. And Max Verstappen in particular, even though he is much more dearly priced than the likes of Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc, he has got an impeccable record at both Spain and Austria. So it makes me think that getting him in this week for a 2-week period isn't the worst idea in the world, just because of that consistency and that reliability we know from him. Not to mention the fact that he has a great record, and I think that should certainly play a role in your decision making. If a driver has historically driven well at a certain track or certain tracks, then there's no reason to think that they're going to have a bad race at the next time they're racing there. So I really like Max for the next couple of race weekends. Again, much like the Red Bull constructor, if you go for someone like Lando Norris or Charles Leclerc because of the more affordable price point, what can you do with that remaining 5 to 7 million? Can you upgrade a backmarker driver to someone a bit better, like a Sonoda or a Stroll or a Magnussen? Or can you improve the constructor from a Mercedes to a McLaren, for example? So I think you've really got to factor that in as well. But I think if you're looking at Max's statistics in a vacuum, he's got an absolute mortgage on points. He's the highest average point scoring driver this season. And when you look at him on sprint races alone, just based on Miami and China this year, he's averaging almost 50 points. Now, if you go back to 2023, I think he was the highest scoring driver on 4 out of the 6 sprint race weekends. So he also has a very good and a proven track record of delivering on those 2 racing sessions. So I really like Max for that, for Austria as a forward planning option. I think, though, if we're looking at single week selections, Lando Norris and Charles Leclerc slightly edge Max Verstappen just because of the fact there's less points on the table to score, and also because the driver of the day is going to bump their points for the weekend up closer to whoever tops the weekend, say Max, for example. And Lando Norris, he has 4 driver of the days. Charles Leclerc, he has 2 driver of the days. And I think if McLaren are the team that's the one to beat, that are looking the best, it's a fair shout Lando Norris is going to get that driver of the day. If it's the case with Ferrari, where they look particularly good, then I think Charles Leclerc's in the box seat for that too. So I think these 2 more affordable drivers on a race weekend just like Spain or just like Canada, for example, are probably better than Max. But I think if you're looking at it over a 2-week period, I think I prefer Max as of right now. So again, your team decisions might be slightly different, but I'm certainly approaching Spain with an element of planning for the next couple race weekends, whether or not I just use 1 transfer in Spain and then have 3 in Canada, 3 in Austria to use on Max then, or do I just bring in Max now, assume his consistency and reliability will deliver over Spain and over Austria, and then I don't have to worry about booking a transfer in for Austria for 1 week to get him in and then take him out the following week. So again, a lot to think about, but I think you can make a case for all 3 drivers on screen right now. But I think based on my plans, it's likely going to be Charles Leclerc because he's already in my team, or Max Verstappen with the intention, as I said, to forward plan. Now, this is a slightly different section. And again, the last few weeks, I've mixed up my preview and final thoughts a little bit, but I really like this power rankings section because a lot of you have asked me, what about driver A versus driver B? Or who should I go for out of these 2 versus those 2? And I think looking at this list, the way I want to structure it is how I view these drivers heading into the upcoming race weekend based on A, form, historical form, but B, also where I view them relative to their rivals on the grid for the upcoming race weekend too. And I've got green arrows next to Russell and Hamilton because I think their stock very much rose in Canada as well as it did in Monaco too. I think they've got a lot more comfortable with the car. Their performance certainly is much higher than where it was at the start of the season. And I also think that they're at a much more affordable price than the likes of Leclerc, Norris, for example. If you're running a 2 B-tier driver lineup, such as Leclerc and someone else, Leclerc Piastri or Leclerc and Sainz, Hamilton and Russell around that price point are easy swaps if Mercedes suddenly look good. So I do think their stock is on the up. It really, again, comes down to free practice, but I have got Hamilton, and I think he's had the fastest lap the last couple of race weekends, so his price and his points have gone up as a result of that. I think also because typically Mercedes are usually a bit further down the order on Sunday. They have enough of a delta between them and the teams further back in the midfield to pit again for a soft tyre and push for the fastest lap. So I do think this is a possibility going forward. Don't, I think, let that be the focal point of your decision-making process for getting in a George Russell or Lewis Hamilton. But I do think their stock is on the rise regardless, and their car looks like a much more improved version of the one we saw earlier in the season. In terms of drivers, I think that are probably going down a little bit. Esteban Ocon, although had his best fantasy performance of the season in Canada with all of those overtakes and positions gained, I do think will not have the same upside heading into Spain. That 5-place grid penalty was what set him up for all of those extra positions and passes. That's not going to happen again in Spain. There's no likelihood of that from what we've seen. There was no incidents on track or anything like that to suggest he will be having a grid penalty. So assume he qualifies as normal. I don't think the money or the value is there when you look at the likes of his teammate who's $1 million less and is producing just about the same output every single race weekend. There might be 1 or 2 points in it, but I think for a driver like Gasly, who is very consistent and reliable, you're getting a lot more value out of him than, say, Ocon, who also is probably subject to team orders. We saw that in Canada. I think that's going to continue throughout the season, given he won't be with Alpine in 2025. So I think Ocon's stock is going down into Spain. Another driver, which, I mean, his stock hasn't really flown at all this season, is Logan Sargent. I think that DNF in Canada really reaffirmed to me how unreliable he is. I think a lot of us now have budget to spread it around other parts of our teams. And I think if you've got enough budget, Sargent is probably the man to get rid of. That inconsistency, for me, just terrifies me. I'm always hiding behind the sofa when he's in my team. And I think even though there's nothing to suggest he will be sacked halfway through the season, I think there's still a slight possibility. Sure, I think it's very likely he'll be driving for Williams in FP1 at some point this season, which is why the FIA and that change to the super license age was modified for him, for Andrea Kimi Antonelli to replace Logan Sargent. But I do think in the off chance Sargent is replaced throughout the season, you're going to have to get rid of him anyway. Although some people might argue, 0 points for Logan Sargent as an inactive driver in my team throughout the season is probably not the worst idea in the world. But I do think you're probably not going to run him for another 15 races should he get sacked. So I do think the likelihood of getting rid of him sooner rather than later is much higher and probably not the worst idea in the world either. But I think in terms of all the other drivers on screen, I'm not going to go through every single one. The intent for this moving forward is just for me to, in my opinion, rank where I think they all stack up relative to each other in their respective tiers. But I do think that there probably is, some nuance around who goes where. You might argue, for example, let's say Sainz is above Hamilton, or Norris is above Verstappen, or Hülkenberg is above Magnussen. I don't think it really matters, but that's, I think, generally how they would sit for me, based on their price, based on their fantasy production, and based on where I see them as a viable fantasy asset into the weeks ahead. In terms of the weather forecast for Spain, it's going to be dry pretty much all of Friday and Saturday. There is reports and a forecast of rain on the morning of the Sunday. I think by the time the race rolls around in the afternoon, the track will be dry, or whether the skies will be clear. But I think that's just something to keep in mind. We know forecasts can change on a dime. So in the off chance rain continues throughout the afternoon, I think that opens the door for maybe a chip or two, like the no negative, like the autopilot, like we saw people use in Canada. But Spain in general is a low DNF track. And I do think if the rain clears, it should be a pretty non-event in terms of chip usage and such. But again, forecast looks to be dry for the most part. I wouldn't be too worried about it at this point in time. And team and chip strategy, already talked about this already a lot. I like Leclerc for one-off sprint weekends. I like Norris for that driver of the day vote that he's got in his pocket most often than not. And then I think over the next couple of weeks, Verstappen to plan for the Austria sprint. And in terms of just how good he is at Spain as well, it's a Red Bull track. So I think if you're looking to bring him in for 1 week in Austria and then get rid of him, why not just get him in a week early and plan for other drivers around that once you get to Austria? Because I think also having a couple of trades to use on more of the midfield or back market drivers might be more valuable. I don't know. But I do think Verstappen, if you're getting him in for 1 week, it doesn't really make... If you're only getting him in for 1 week, it doesn't really make sense. So if you are looking to bring him in for the next couple of weeks, that's why I really like him as your DRS boost option. So I also just want to quickly cover off what my team again is looking like for Spain. Now, there's been a few different dilemmas I'm grappling with at the moment. The most obvious one is Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton. Now, I think if they continue to look good in practice, which, could be very well possible. I'm not writing anything off. We know how interesting practice has been at various points this season. Then maybe I just roll with Hamilton and Mercedes for 1 more week, roll a transfer into Spain, into Austria, and replace Logan Sargent with someone like Yuki Tsunoda. It could really be that easy. It would also mean I could use up some of that budget I had sitting on the side in Canada too. But I really like Yuki as a reliable option. You could also go K-Mag for that budget gain, but the consistency, the performances I've seen from Yuki, I've been really encouraged. He's gone down a couple 0 million as well. So on the back of that result in Canada, I don't really see that happening every single race weekend. So I may as well cash in or capitalize on that slightly lower price by getting him into my team now. Now, I think if in the off chance Mercedes do look a little off the pace, there's a couple of different options I've got for me. I think the first could be the wild card, and I'd pretty much just gut my team, bring in Max Verstappen and set it up for Austria there. But I could also go for a -10 potentially. Actually, I may not be able to go for a -10, but I'd essentially reverse the Mercedes trades I made last week and bring back in Oscar Piastri and the McLaren constructor. That would leave me with 7.5 million, which wouldn't be enough for anyone else other than Logan Sargent. So I actually would end up just making 2 trades. Do I want that? Maybe, maybe not. It would have to, Red Bull would really have to look off the pace for me to not really entertain them. And by that point, I think wildcard for Max is probably an option. But let's say, yeah, if I didn't have that, I'd have Oscar back. Logan would stay in that slot there. Now, if Red Bull look good, as I said, there's a couple of different options I could take. I'd likely strip out Mercedes. I'd probably get rid of Bottas and I'd get rid of Charles Leclerc. Zhou, as the second most affordable driver in the game behind Sargent, is probably just going to be kept in there, not to mention that he always does qualify quite low. I think this would also hinge on McLaren being quite competitive, but I do think, based on the news around them making up some time in the lower speed corners versus those higher speed corners, that could come into play here. Then Max would be in the 2x slot, and then probably fill out the rest of my team with the likes of Tsunoda, Magnussen, and Hülkenberg. Now, that would give me about 1.2. I could potentially use that on Zhou and get in Pierre Gasly, but I think for me, Zhou is probably a slightly longer term hold than Gasly. I think Zhou's naturally always going to be qualifying towards the back, as opposed to Gasly, which his performances could be mixed week to week. So I think having Zhou there as the second most affordable asset, there's no Sargent. You've also got typically high budget gainers in the Haas duo and Tsunoda, and you got Max for the next couple of weeks. So I really like that. The only other eventuality would be if Perez and Max are both running, P1, P2, 3 all of practice. Now, I could get to a non-Sargent Red Bull Ferrari lineup. I think that would mean Bottas and then Gasly. Yeah, so I could do something like that if, for instance, Red Bull looked dominant here in Spain and again are expected to be dominant in Austria, which is also a track suited to their car. So I think that could be another type of lineup I go with. But at this point, I'm probably rambling and got so many different options on the table based on the outcomes in free practice. In terms of my very, very final thoughts on my deadline stream over on FanAmp, with Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ on the Fantasy Formula, we will not be back for a stream this week. We're both unavailable, unfortunately, due to personal commitments. But I will be doing my best to answer all of your questions on Twitter in the lead up to the deadline. So you can find me on there at F1 Fantasy Hub. I'll do my best to reply to all of your comments on YouTube, as I typically do. But that's probably where you can find me, in the comments here and on Twitter, for any last minute questions and concerns. But as always, guys, good luck with your teams this weekend. Thank you always for watching, and I'll see you all very soon.